downtown. The people are rising.
One, I hope you guys got a lot to eat, but not too much that you won't be able to pay attention. What a beautiful crowd. Thank you so much to the Budget Center for creating such space in this important conference for this very important conversation. There is a fifth chair on stage. You might have a surprise guest. I guess he wants to save all the drama for the last minute and showing up. So we will announce that fifth guest once they get here. So again, let me just say my name is John Kim, President and CEO of Catalyst California, also a proud board member of the Budget Center. And I'm sort of very humbled and honored to be able to moderate this very important panel around pathways to reparations. I'm excited to join some of my personal heroes and sheroes in this work, the ever extraordinary, ever wise Felicia Jones, James Big Game Woodson, and the legendary Don Tamaki. We'll save the last announcement in terms of the panelists later. But let me set the container for this conversation by stating the obvious. Reparations as a concept is one of those things that is simultaneously very simple and also very, very complex. As a parent, it's a fundamental principle we strive to teach our children, right? Mm-hmm. If they wrong someone, intentionally or not, you have a duty to make it right. This is something we all need to focus on as parents to really support our kids. If your kid harms another, make sure that they understand the impact of what they did. Acknowledge the harm and apologize. And then you and the kid have work to do to repair the damage and get assurances that it won't happen again, all right? This is a basic gameplay for any parent. And any parent here that doesn't do that with their kids, just know that we're all giving you that stink eye, right? Because this is our job to make sure our kids become responsible members of society. Now, obviously, when it comes to acknowledging and making amends for 400 years of chattel slavery and the ongoing commodification, extraction, and terror of black lives in America and in California, it is a wildly more complicated question than that. But I find that every now and then, it's helpful to not be paralyzed by the complexity, to boil it back down to the basics, to our values, and to the simple rules of the road. Now, why California? Why is this conversation needing to happen here? Because I think many of us in this room understand that if the American experiment is to fail, it'll be because of our childlike refusal to contend with our difficult collective history. And as a state, we need to understand that leadership is not just a ribbon. That leadership means that we do the very hard work to work through these very difficult issues. And now, why us? Why us here in this room? Because we know that this is not, when we talk about reparations, not just about cash payments. It's not even about a multi-year policy and legislative package. It's about power. It's about collective power of all of our communities, especially the ones most harmed by our systems. And it's about whether or not this dream for a multiracial democracy really stands a chance. That's why my organization, Catalyst California, was so very honored to be asked to join the core partners table for the Alliance for Reparations, Reconciliation, and Truth, and we'll talk about that alliance. Want to make sure that people know that it's under the leadership of our Vice President, Dr. Dobard, who's not here, and also our Sacramento lead, Sedalia King, who is here. So I'm hoping Sedalia can give a big wave over there. That's how we show up as Catalyst as part of this alliance. So thank you for their leadership. But this is also why I'm very eager to now shut up, get out the way, and let these panelists into the conversation. Just as a quick program note, because we are expecting a fourth panelist, I assume, maybe, we'll see. But we are expecting a fourth panelist, so I may cut Q&A from the audience because we have a lot to cover and very little time. All right? So let's get into this. So starting back at the basics, in terms of the term reparations in this context, help us understand. Felicia, I'm going to go to you first. What it's meant by that term and unpacking some of the common misconceptions around it.
Yeah, we know it simply as repair. You've said it already, and I think we take an approach that is looking at the harm that needs to be repaired, and we mostly think about in philanthropy. I'll say a little bit about the Black Equity Collective. The Black Equity Collective is an ecosystem of Black-led organizations and funders who are working toward the long-term sustainability of those Black-led organizations. And we understood that philanthropy had a role to play in repairing the harm. And in the case of philanthropy, many of you know that certainly the wealth of corporations and foundations is really comes, unfortunately, at the hands of exploited labor. And so when we think about repair and when we think about harm, we know that philanthropy has a part to play in that. And we also know that this conversation around reparations, this very public conversation, cannot happen unless philanthropy is simultaneously talking about reparations, talking about repair, and also making the conditions for repair to happen.
That's right.
So that's how we generally look at it. But it's a very simple term. It is repairing harm, a harm that has been caused.
That's right. Thank you so much, Felicia. James from the California Black Power Network wanted to see if you had something to share with this room on what reparations means.
Yeah, so for me, two things. One is we can't talk about budgets, money, capital, without talking about how we got that money, capital, right? And the foundation of what this country, what this state was based off of is stolen free labor, right?
Yeah.
We can't escape that. Somebody reaped the benefits of that stolen free labor. And so again, right, like we can talk about budget deficits, we can talk about surpluses, but we got here based off of something, right? The other thing that I think is just important to distinguish is, all of our work is sort of based in, wanting to make things more equal, equity, things like that. But reparations is really rooted in history and rooted in, like Felicia said, repair. And so it's ironic to see, conservatives who will pull out money from our education system, that want to ban certain history books, right, that want to change history, largely because they don't want us to talk about how we got where we are, right? And so for me, reparations is always tied to history, right? That it is not just about slavery, but it's also about its vestiges, what it turned into, right? That it turned into Jim Crow, that it turned into redlining, that it turned into mass incarceration, the war on drugs. All of these things are things that need to be repaired. We know, right, that the foundation of, again, this country is based off of stolen land and stolen labor. And we got to grapple with those things if we're going to talk about moving forward. So,
thank you so much, James. So, Don, you were not only a task force member, but you've done a lot of work, very commendable work, talking to non-Black audiences about this question of reparations. So James and Felicia talked a lot about what it is in terms of reparations. Can you talk a little bit about what it isn't, what you're hearing in terms of false narratives out there in the world, and how we can show that they really don't hold water?
Yeah, well, thank you, John, for teeing it off that way. I am talking to the choir here, I think, in many ways. Of 9 members on the task force, I was the only one who's not Black on that task force. And look at me, I stick out like a sore thumb. And I think the running joke at the task force was, a general running joke was, who's that little Asian man photobombing the group task force picture? So it really is one of my roles to reach out to non-Black audiences. And some of the arguments, the narrative against reparations, you all are quite familiar, and I'll sort of recite them. They're reasonable in many ways, but they also have reasonable responses. They fall in generally into about 5 buckets, I'd say. One is it's too late. This is all about slavery, which ended in 1865. California entered the Union as a non-slave state. Happened a long time ago, regrettable, but get over it. Well, as you all know, slavery did last 246 years. Black Americans have been longer enslaved than they have been free. You add another 100 years of Jim Crow and decade after decade of systematic exclusion, and you have a reverberating consequences well into the 20th century. Another argument is it's too much. We can't afford it. What you all know is the folks in policy that the cost of not addressing this unreckoned wrong is astronomical, and it's only going to get worse, whether we're talking about healthcare, housing, every metric that matters in California. Another argument is it's unwarranted. It's a level playing field. We're a colorblind society. We've elected a black president. Try harder. And again, peeling back the veneer here and exposing the truth of what John has said, we spent a good 500 pages of our final report drawing a through line from the harm of the past reverberating through the centuries and the decades leading to today's consequences, resulting in black households having 9 times less assets than white households, black people living on average in California almost 8 years less, huge disparities in just about every metric that matters. Another argument is it's not my fault. I was not an enslaver. I didn't discriminate against anybody. Why should I, as a taxpayer, have to pay for this? I think the answer is this is a collective debt. Every sector of white society benefited from the institution not only of enslavement, but in separating America into white and black and everybody else kind of somewhere in between. Whether you look at housing, the development of urban renewal, commercial developments, stadiums, parks, upscale residential developments. For example, between the 1950s into the 1970s, there were 2,532 eminent domain projects in the United States in 992 cities, displacing 1 million people who lost their homes, 2/3 of whom were black. And so this wealth that is created for entire regions, these changes that increase the productivity of California, they're really born on the backs of one particular group. And so the argument is, it's not my fault. Well, we as taxpayers pay for all kinds of things, whether they're natural disasters, human-caused wrongs, wars, whether we agree with them or not, whatever. And those become societal obligations. I think the last argument is, what about? What about other groups that have also suffered greatly discrimination? And the argument, I think, really translates, if we can't solve for all at once, all at the same time, we're not going to solve for black people. And that is not how we operate as Americans, at least the America we aspire to be. In good economies and bad, we need to figure this out. And if it can be done all at once, it should be done that way. If it has to be done serially and opening the door, then we do it that way. In the case of African Americans in particular, we're talking about an unreckoned wrong spanning centuries. Promises broken, whether they were Field Order 15 and 40 acres from South Carolina to Florida, 400,000 acres distributed to 40,000 enslaved people who worked the land, owned the land, until Lincoln was assassinated, and 4 months later, Johnson rescinded that land reparations deal. And all of these things continue to recycle in one form or another throughout American history. So these are societal obligations, and we should not be playing the what about game.
Thank you, Don. Next time I get into legal trouble, you're my guy as a litigator. As you may have noticed, we are joined by a fourth panelist. Because this is such an extraordinary, important conversation, because he's an organizer by heart, he's not my official assembly member, but he's our guy, Assembly Member Isaac Bryant. Thank you for joining us, sir. So you have been an organizer, one of our best, a researcher, a scholar, an advocate before this current role as a legislator. And the task force finished its work right about the time you were coming in, right? Or a little after you came in as a legislator. Can you tell us a bit about what that political moment meant for you as a black legislator?
Yeah, and it's good to be here. Sorry I'm late. Thank you all for being here. Every space that we are having these conversations and learning from the folks who have really done the work, whose shoulders we stand on, it's a moment that gives me a lot of hope at a time that's actually incredibly difficult and challenging. It takes organizing in these spaces, organizing politically, organizing in community to really make the change that we deserve. I've been asked this question a variety of ways. What's it like being a legislature walking in to the reparations package? And I actually have to do a little history for folks who didn't know this. But I was actually the expert witness who testified in the Judiciary Committee with then Assemblywoman Shirley Weber when she first introduced this bill. I helped write the fact sheet. The Ralph Bunche Center and one of my mentors, Dr. Kelly Lado Hernandez, were intimately involved in the early construction of the task force legislation that then prompted the 2 years of tremendous community work. And so this reparations framework to me has always been a way of thinking. In my mind, if you're not organizing for repair, if you're not organizing for restoration, if you're not organizing for a correcting of the wrongs that have been done, then you're not really organizing for justice. And so these things have always been linked together for me. Although I am cognizant of the fact that the language we use in community and the language we use politically doesn't always line up, right? I know many abolitionists. I don't know many in the Capitol. But I do know folks who would use words like equity and reinvestment and reimagine, not knowing that they're actually saying abolitionist a bunch of different ways. And the same is true for reparations. And what I'm grateful to the task force work in doing is that it's taught us collectively as an institution, the State Assembly and the State Senate, to not be afraid to call something out by its rightful name, especially in the pursuit of justice. And so being an elected official now and organizing and coming from those roots in this moment, I'm just organizing my colleagues now. It's a different type of messaging. It's a different set of tools, but it's the same purpose. And so for all of you who are organizing, including the organizers of today's conference, you are utilizing the very same tools for justice and for change that have to happen in our legislature. And I'm grateful to be one of those assembly members who's utilizing those tools along with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So let's talk about the landscape right now. Yes, actually, let's go ahead and give Assembly Member a round of applause. I've seen him organize up front. I've had front row seats, and so I don't think these other legislators have a chance. So I'm loving to see it. All right, let's talk about the landscape a little bit right now. We just had the task force. The legislators got the ball. Legislatures got the ball, and others need to be picking up the ball some too. And we have this alliance. If we could just talk through these different parts of the landscape. Don, I am going to come back to you very quickly. If you could, tell us about the Reparations Task Force, its work, and the report. Because that report, to me, is such an extraordinary document. Again, both historically, politically, and as a moral document, was such extraordinary work. If you could just say a little bit about the task force and its work at this point. Well,
Member Brian, we really appreciate task force members, and thank you for addressing the task force at its last hearing. We're grateful for that. So the one deliverable from the task force is a monumental 1,100-page final report with the imprimatur of the state of California. And the strength of the report is it's 1,100 pages and extremely comprehensive. The weakness of the report is it's 1,100 pages. But within that, it's available online if you haven't seen it. For example, there's a near 500-page report just tracking the history. 13 chapters, begins with enslavement, goes next into racial terror, political disenfranchisement, then into segregation. And you could see there's a continuum leading to today's outcomes. Each chapter begins with the national landscape and ends with California's role in the harm. So even though California entered the Union as a non-slave state, it was a leader in racially exclusionary policies right up through well into the 20th century. And so that in itself creates the foundation for the rationale as to why, reparations and why now. And then it goes into various recommendations, including 115 of them for repair. And so that was a 2-year process. The task force sunsetted on June 30th and 2023 when we submitted our groundbreaking report to the legislature. And we're so grateful to the California Legislative Black Caucus for introducing the first of 14 bills, and there'll be other bills being introduced by other members and senators. And we go from there, and the second part of it, I'll let James and Felicia talk about that, which is moving the needle of public opinion. And that involves you all as well working with us to really explain what reparations is. Out of 115 proposals for repair, only a few of them deal with individual compensation. The rest of it have to do with policies that will, for example, black infant mortality over 10 years in San Francisco is literally 5 times the rate of white babies. And so these are systemic outcomes that you are very familiar with that need to be addressed, and they are also in the form of the recommendations. So in a nutshell, I think that's
Thank you.
what we've done.
Indeed. We had 2 other task force members that were going to join us. They're fortunately in Geneva right now making the case on the international stage. But the task force did its job, right? The idea was to kick in the door with some real understanding and information. You guys built the weight for that report to maybe knock down the door by itself, but it's an extraordinary document. The football is now in the hands of the legislature and the executive, hopefully, and all of us to move it forward. Assemblymember Bryant, what are you hoping to see coming out of this legislature moving forward on this?
Yeah, it's an interesting time because the 2 members of the legislature who served on the task force are terming out right now. And there's a number of us, especially in the Legislative Black Caucus, that actually have, if the people will have us, a 10-year runway. This is a powerful, powerful opportunity to not just pass the 14 bills that we've introduced now, but the 115 that make up that report. This is how we started our political journey in Sacramento, was receiving this document, not just from any task force, by the way, one who did righteous and thoughtful and committed community listening and crafting its work, and one that was housed in the DOJ. You have a lot of options when you build a task force of where you place it and what kinds of institutional frameworks give it legitimacy and credibility. Having this report documented by the Department of Justice gives California a permanent historical archive of the work of this task force, and we owe all of you a debt of gratitude. But with the ball now being in our court, I would like to see us tackle these recommendations in part and in full over the next several years, and certainly over my time in the legislature. I get asked constantly and often, what does that mean for cash transfers and direct compensation? And I promise you, if it was up to me, I would have started that process today, especially since in California we have a history now of getting money directly in the hands of the people. Anybody remember the little ATM card with the golden bear on it for about $200?
Yep.
We called it a gas rebate because we had reached the GAN limit and we literally had to return money to the taxpayers. Anybody remember their Golden State stimulus check? Or stimmies, as we called them in my neighborhood? We know how to get folks cash, direct compensation. We launched $35 million in universal basic income programs all across the state, including the Breathe program in LA County, the 2nd Supervisorial District. We know how to get resources to folks. So why is it that we can't include that in the conversation about what repair and restoration looks like for black folks in California? And I would argue we can, and we have to. And I think that's what the reparations report we received and what the task force has also told us, that it's not either or, it's both and. And we have to keep that guiding point even as we're introducing the kinds of pragmatic, thoughtful recommendations that we believe we can pass this year. We have to change hearts and minds outside of the Capitol, but even in the Capitol, I can't tell you how powerful it is to get my colleagues in the habits of voting yes on reparations proposals. We've started this informal thing in the Black Caucus. We tried it out yesterday, actually, where when a reparations proposal, one of our core bills, is on the floor, all members of the caucus stand up. And I don't know why we started doing that, but we just have. And you can feel the energy in the room different. And you can feel the weight on that vote for my colleagues feeling different. And I think they should feel that weight until this work is done. Because that weight is more than a 1,000-page report. That weight is 400 years. That weight is 13 generations. That weight is the ancestors who aren't with us and who paid a tremendous price that we have to put the work in to repair and restore. And so that's what it means to have the ball in our court right now, but we in the Black Caucus have taken that and we've taken our ownership of it. We've received it from the task force. We're grateful. And in my time here, I'd like to see us get through every single one of those recommendations.
Wonderful. Excellent. Thank you. There's the inside game, and with leaders like Assemblymember Bryant, it's very hopeful. But there's also the outside game, which also you were very familiar with. The outside game, there's a lot happening in the landscape. I think it's an extraordinarily important moment in terms of our chances when we have established now this alliance for reparations, reconciliation, and truth. I know, James, you've been a big part of this as well as others. If you could say a little bit more and tell the audience what that alliance is about.
Yeah, I mean, Assemblymember Bryant just hit on it, right? That there are hearts and minds that we got to change outside of the legislature. And, right, that this is not just about the Black Caucus pushing this, right? They are playing a very important role, but their colleagues need to be pushed on it, and he just said that, right? Part of that is also getting their constituents to say that they are also for reparations. And so that is why we have formed this sort of multiracial alliance and coalition to both, right? Like, one of the things that we're seeing is that Black folks just generally, sometimes, like, if you poll them, they don't even think that reparations can happen because that is what society has done to Black folks, right? Have taken away some folks' hope. And so some of it is like, you know, telling them, like, we have this opportunity to really move something in California, right? That is the role of the California Black Power Network, the role of Black Equity Collective is to really sort of focus on Black communities. But we knew, right, from a moral standpoint, but also just a practical standpoint, that it can't just be about Black communities and Black people, that we have to have other communities standing with us. I'm really proud, not only just to be on the stage with two folks who are from this community, but to see the amount of API communities and groups that have come alongside of us, particularly Japanese American groups and individuals, has been really heartening to see. Sometimes when we were in other battles, they were holding down reparations on our behalf, which is really powerful. But essentially, right, this is a multi-faceted, multi-strategy approach that includes, you know, communications, that includes legal defense, right? We know that there's going to be attacks in the courts on any reparations legislation that's passed. You know, this is about policy. It's about engagement in the Capitol. It's about organizing philanthropy, which I know Felicia will talk more about. but really bringing all of those things to bear to try to, create a foundation that makes Assemblymember Bryan's job easier as he's pushing in the legislature. The last thing I want to say is that, not to undercut sort of what the legislature is doing, they have a really important role. But the point is that there are pieces of our Constitution that need to be changed, that ultimately voters are responsible for changing, right? Right now, there's something called ACA 8. We still have involuntary servitude. We still have slavery on the books in California, right? And so, again, this is not just about leaving in the hands of legislators. This is also about bringing voters, bringing California residents along with us. And that's really what the Alliance for Reparations is about.
Yeah, I made a reference at a dinner we had last night to a TV show called Voltron. I want to see if anybody in the audience knows Voltron as a TV show. Okay, one lonely hand. Okay, like the A-Team. The A-Team. People know the A-Team? Yes? Okay. This is what it's going to take, right? It's going to take multiple players from multiple vantage points to be in alignment, to be in strategy, to move the ball. Because you mentioned philanthropy. Philanthropy is going to be another key part of this conversation. It's going to be the inside. It's going to be the outside in the movement, and it's going to be about philanthropy. And so, Felicia, if you could say a little bit about the ways that philanthropy has been in vanguard, right, in terms of supporting power building and Black leadership, but what is it going to take moving forward?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I do want to shout out the fact that philanthropy has stepped up. We now have a Black power building ecosystem that is being funded.
Woo, woo.
But I also want to say, yes, so
do it.
we want to shout out and we know that foundations are also doing their own internal work. I want to also acknowledge, like the Weingart Foundation, who has also acknowledged its own, it's the harm it has sort of created.
Where that money came from.
Yeah, where their money came from and how they are working through their own internal reconciliation, and also making a long-term commitment to fund Black liberation work. Obviously, we need this work funded. We need it funded for the long haul, but we need, we also need funders not to grow weary or weak. We are in a context where, the Supreme Court decision is causing funders to sort of have moments of pause in their investments. Unfortunately, while we have had $1 billion of commitment, that funding has not yet completely materialized. And so we are seeing the sort of retrenchment and moments of pause. This is not the time to pause. So we actually need philanthropy to be courageous, to be a leader, and to build their race-conscious muscle so that they are, one, staying with us for the long haul, and not only just using their dollars, but using their platforms like this to share and make sure that we're educating and giving people a more expansive view of what reparations is. This work is going to take community-based organizations who are funded and supported and have infrastructure to withstand a long movement building effort.
That's right.
And they will need capacity. They will need just incredible support. We also see them in this ecosystem that we're building as incredible power. And we want to be able to organize that power in a way that does touch voters, that touches the masses, that organizes our allies. Those are the strategies that I think we are really, that we're looking forward to engaging philanthropy in. So I'm going to keep having the same conversation. We need philanthropy. And while we're having a public conversation, the legislature is doing its work, we need people who are able to go and have conversations and be the voices behind our courageous legislators who are moving policy proposals. And they also need to hear what the people actually want.
That's right.
So, we still have a lot of work to do.
It gives me so much hope when we think about the legislature, philanthropy, this alliance, this movement, to have leaders like this, like Felicia in philanthropy. We have Kathy Cha here. We have Veronica Carrizales. There's a changing tide in philanthropy, and I hope this message is being heard. This moment doesn't also have its challenges, right? So let's talk about some of these challenges. The SCOTUS ruling, the anti-affirmative ruling, or affirmative action ruling, other related legal attacks, we can't ignore those things here in California. And so, Don, you know, facing this kind of backlash, what are the implications for our reparations efforts here?
Well, as everybody in this audience knows, we've been living in a Prop 209 world for 20 years. I mean, California's had to adjust to this landscape. And with the SFA ruling, it simply spreads it nationwide in the area, in particular, of higher education. But there are groups that are trying to push the envelope out. And there is a chilling effect, John, as you pointed out, where philanthropists, colleges, and universities and others are retrenching to a degree more than they need to do. And so there are lawyers now, you know, advising on this in terms of dealing with this. In terms of the task force, for example, there are a couple things that the report sort of deals with this issue even before these rulings came down. For example, in order to increase funding, in particular Black neighborhoods, that's all done in a formulaic kind of way. And our recommendations talk about increasing funding in, quote, formerly redlined neighborhoods. You know, between the 1930s and right through the 1970s, every major city in California was redlined. And if you align the redlining maps in Oakland or Los Angeles against today's maps of the most segregated, the most polluted, the most deprived, underserved neighborhoods, they align exactly. The past essentially created our present. And so rather than say, you know, Black neighborhoods are going to get more funding, it will say, you know, formerly redlined neighborhoods and tie it to an historical event. Similarly, on areas of restitution, where restitution can be done, Bruce's Beach, land grabs, urban renewal, 1956, 20,000 Black residents in the Fillmore lost their homes. Almost 900 Black businesses were destroyed. Many people never to become homeowners again. Right. Well, these are events, they're historical events, and while the city's taking was racially motivated, there's no question about that, the remedies can be framed in a way that survive, we think, strict scrutiny, as lawyers would call it. So that's the navigating that has to be done, but it requires all of us to double down. And I think the other thing is, politically speaking, there needs to be a response. There needs to be a pushback. Right. The Chief Justice, John Roberts, said the way you stop discrimination is to stop discriminating. But the harm has to be reckoned with, as you all know. So I think there are ways to do it, and we're grappling with them now.
Yeah, California's done, and local jurisdictions here have done great work utilizing data and indicators to target geographies that will have great effects, right? In terms of this. We lose often when we overreact. When people flinch at us or come at us, we overreact, we bear down, and this is a moment for us to be bold, right? The right has actually said their litigation tactic is not always based on legal fact. It's gonna be based on, can we scare them to chill out and not talk about race so much, right? And that's what we can't overreact to. We also, James, have are in the midst of a national presidential election, and race is front and center. Where should California position itself in terms of if these election results are hostile to reparations?
Yeah, I mean, I think California needs to do what it always does, right? Which is to try to be a beacon of hope, to set a model for the rest of the country, right? California is the first state to actually take on a state task force on reparations. It also represents, I think, maybe now the 4th largest economy in the world. And so, right, if we can show that we could do reparations here in California, it will certainly have an impact on the rest of the country, regardless of what happens federally. But I want to just underscore the point that you just made, John, which is, you know, as much as the current status quo makes it feel like that, you know, we are sort of in this sort of you know, static moment, that nothing's really changing, right? There are things that we need to protect, but life will still go on. The point is that we're in a constant power struggle that is now playing out nationally. You know, I heard Senator Wiener up here earlier that was talking about how corporations and the California Business Roundtable has been holding a gun to our head with the Taxpayer Deception Act. But the fact is that big corporations have always been holding a gun to our head, right? When we even look at sort of how taxes work, right? At one point, corporate tax rate was 90%. And so, right, going back to maybe the point that I made earlier, there has been clear, you know, resources, economic wealth that has been extracted from not just the Black community, from Native communities, indigenous, from Latino communities, right? And this is really about setting a model for what a fight against that actually will look like. And so California has a perfect opportunity to show that we will not just take the scare tactics, right? That we will fight back, and that we are prepared for this power struggle that we're in.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Sure. You know, we have a conference room here full of budget nerds, so let's talk budget. It's always said, and always seems to be said when it comes to reparations, now is not the time. This is not the year. It's a common refrain, and it's interesting because, yeah, we are facing a 68 or a 38 or 58 or a $78 billion deficit. Hopefully people will figure that out relatively soon. And of course, this makes it difficult to cover the priorities of so many of us. And will make it difficult, the conversation, to subsidize the reparations priorities. Oddly enough, the state seems to do a pretty good job subsidizing other priorities, like $80 billion for corporations that are making record profits and other high wealth individuals through tax expenditures. They do a good job with that, but there's not enough money for this. And so in this context, how should we think about this reparations fight in this budgetary moment? And so I'm going to first kick it over to you, Assembly Member, and how we should think about this from your vantage point, and then to James and others.
Do not let the legislature or the governor off the hook. I say that knowing full well many of you are tagging me online on a consistent basis saying, where's my check? I got it. And you don't have to stop. You can keep doing that. I think it's more effective to focus on some other folk, but you can keep doing that. We are the 4th, 5th largest economy in the world. There will be $300 billion coming out of the state of California's state government going into different priorities, programs, industries. We subsidize oil companies still. We have to stop that. The last 2 years in the legislature, by the way, we knew we were going off a cliff. From the day I got in here, I was told we got a bunch of money for now and it's going down. We took a vote last year in the state legislature to increase our corrections spending by $1 billion. The year before that, we took a vote to increase our corrections spending by $500 million annually, ongoing in perpetuity. We've been investing in harm. We've been investing in harm that disproportionately and disparately impacts Black people in California. So you can't tell me that we don't have the resources to foundationally begin a reparations conversation or to start to make amends, to start to do that repair work when we can invest in these kinds of institutions. So even though it's a budget shortfall year and it's difficult, it is absolutely difficult. I've seen scenarios where we're laying off teachers. I've seen scenarios where we're cutting dental care for children and seeing eye dogs and all kinds of horrible disasters if we make the wrong decisions. So hold us accountable to making the right decisions. All my budget folks here in the room, go through every single trailer bill that we're introducing. Go through the early action items that we just introduced as we are, so that you can fight alongside us to make sure that the reductions happen in our systems of harm. Because if we do that correctly, there might even be opportunities to invest in systems of care and opportunity to build out the kind of reparations infrastructure that we need. And so that is what I'm focused on. We did a department by department analysis of our early action items just a couple weeks ago. We took more from the Port of Oakland than we took from the entire corrections department. We took nearly $500 million in pledges to the UC system, less than $100 million from the corrections department. But if you didn't know any of that until this moment, then the responsibility is on you too. Because I can't just fight by myself, and neither can the other courageous elected officials who you've sent to Sacramento to do this work. It takes all of us. But I'm not convinced that a down budget year means we can't do righteous and honorable and good work. I think a down budget year means we have to do it now more than ever.
All right, you heard it. I can't believe Assemblymember Bryant, he confirmed 2 hours ago, he got the questions 30 minutes ago, and just, okay. I'm sorry to make you go after him. But James, from your vantage point from the outside, in this budget year, how should we be thinking about it?
Yeah, I mean, so ditto to all of that. I think it's really important to understand the moment that we're in and what's actually happening, right? That there are, you mentioned, John, that there are corporations that are getting big tax breaks. At the same time, they're supporting a measure that is designed to roll back, gains that we made on criminal justice. They're trying to criminalize communities who sometimes, right, are taking things for basic needs, right? And they are trying to strip the government of its ability to raise revenue, to operate, right? And so in that moment, right, I told Chris I wasn't going to do this, but I'm sorry, Chris, I changed my mind.
Do it.
To have a position that you won't raise revenue, but also support reparations in the same way that our governor does is an untenable, hypocritical position, right? The fact of the matter is, again, I said this before, there has been wealth extracted, and it's now sitting with certain forces that are now still trying to harm Black and brown communities. And to think that you won't rectify that, right? To say that you're for reparations but won't rectify that dynamic is not tenable, right? And so the other thing I wanted to mention before I hand it back, John, is Citigroup did a study back in 2020. They looked at 20 years, so 2000 to 2020, and they looked at exactly how much anti-Black discrimination and racism was stripping from the economy. And the number that they ended up coming up with was $16 trillion just in that 20 years, right? That doesn't account for all of the centuries of harm that's been done to Black communities. And then they said over the next 5 years, it would be another $8 trillion, right? And so
That was Citibank.
That's right, that's Citigroup, right?
Yeah.
And so, right, this notion that if we were to give, resources, if we were to repair harm, that we're actually taking from the economy is just not true, right? We've got, to John's point, big corporations that are telling us that that's not true. So again, to hold that position that we can't raise revenue to address things like this is just, it's not true. And to Assemblymember Bryant's point, we should not allow folks to tell us that.
As a board member, I feel like I need to be one of those announcers at the end of those prescription drug commercials. That is the honorable position of this particular panelist and not the budget center. But let's go ahead and move on. All right. Let's start closing it down here. In terms of pathways forward, that's what this is all about. Pathways forward. How should we think about it? And I'm going to ask each of you from your vantage points. Let me start with you, Felicia, from philanthropy. Pathways forward.
Yeah. So, I've shared what philanthropy can do already, and I'll just reiterate. We need the movement supported in multiple ways. We also need philanthropy to do its own internal work. We know that, unfortunately, POC groups and Black-led groups specifically have had a history of underfunding. And so we are pushing for philanthropy to look at its own practices, evaluate where it's directing its resources, and actually to make a commitment to invest 25% of its grant making to Black-led organizations. I just want to put that out there.
25%.
And I also think that more than that. Okay, yes, thank you. More than that. At the minimum, and but also, organizations are starting to think about endowments, and we need to be thinking about how we help nonprofits endow so that they're able to do that work. And certainly, it's going to take all of us, and organizations need to have sustained resources to do this work for the long haul. I also think that, again, there is collaboration with the public sector and the private sector, nonprofits and government, and we need government to also be thinking about nonprofit infrastructure, and also making room for organizations to be able to do the safety net work that they're already doing. So many of the beautiful recommendations out of the task force will need governmental infrastructure and community infrastructure.
That's right.
And so we need to be thinking about how we support that. And so we want organizations to be thinking about nonprofit infrastructure, but also leadership infrastructure. And when we were doing our call, you talked about how a harm is also the fact that leaders and Black-led organizations and institutions have been infiltrated, targeted, and actually discredited and intended to annihilate. And what we actually know from the Black Equity Collective is that if an organization, if somebody wants to take an organization down, the first weakness is usually their financial infrastructure. And so we've invested a lot in infrastructure and making sure that Black nonprofits can stand up and be given the tools so that they're not shaky, that most of them are very small, they're under $500,000 organizations, but they're doing really incredible safety net work. They're touching the ground. They are the boots on the ground that we'll need for this movement, but they also have really important work to do for those recommendations to be realized. So there's a lot that philanthropy can do. There's a lot that we can be doing with our governmental agencies to build that infrastructure. And
Thank you so much, Felicia. In terms of policy, James, moving forward, pathways forward, please.
Yeah, I appreciated that my brother, Assemblymember Bryan, talked about this 10-year runway that him and other legislators have. That's the way we've been thinking about the Alliance for Reparations, Reconciliation, and Truth, is that, right, the harm didn't happen overnight, and so the repair is also not going to happen overnight. That this is a long sort of runway. I think there are 14 bills on the table right now. I know there's individual legislators that also have bills, but there's 115 proposals. And I think if you actually break that down, it's actually 330 some proposals. So this is going to take a minute to do, right? That doesn't mean that we don't need to move, big and boldly, but it just means that that's the level of harm that's been done, right? And so there are 5 UN principles, right? There's rehabilitation, there's restitution, there's compensation, there's satisfaction, which is like apology, and then there's non-repetition, cessation of harm. And we need to move on all of those fronts, right? The reparations is not done just by compensation, right? If we just give people money without changing the way that society works and the rules of the game works, right? Really what we're gonna be doing is giving money to people with wealth, because those folks are gonna buy land or, try to own things, but we know who already owns the things, the capital in our society, right? And so we gotta change the way that the rules of the game work. And so I would agree with my brother, Assemblymember Bryan, that, you do not need to tell him the depth of this issue. What we needed to be doing is talking to folks who are on the sidelines, right? Who won't show up at this meeting and talk about reparations. And I think we just need to continue to support his work, the work that the caucus is doing, particularly as it moves forward. And I think we hope to see much bigger, bolder reforms as we continue to shift the environment to make way for that.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, James. Don, on solidarity, pathway forward.
Well, in terms of building public support for this, it is a matter for non-Black audiences how to communicate that this fight, Black reparations, is their fight too. And I wasn't very involved in the Japanese redress and reparations effort. There is no equivalence between 4 years in a concentration camp and 400 years of oppression. But I can tell you, that was a 20-year movement. So when we talk about the long view, that it's long, but we have to start somewhere, and we have to be pushing this in good economies and bad. This is not a one and done. The harm was centuries in the making. The repairs have to be long in the implementation. And so when I reach out to, for example, AAPI groups that constitute 14% of California, Black people constitute 6%, 14% of the country, unless we reach out to audiences beyond the Black community, it's going to be very hard to continue this movement. So I used to teach, for example, what happened to Japanese Americans is sort of, an example of anti-Asian hate, and maybe begin with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, et cetera. And now, after the 2-year term on the task force, I look at this as all beginning long before Asian Americans arrived on these shores. The racial pathology that began as anti-Black animus has a beginning, and that's 1619. And that pathology simply kind of morphed over time. Black people and indigenous people still the primary targets within the crosshairs, but every now and again, it certainly touched us too. So 1852, California legislated that Black people could not testify against white people. By 1854, the California Supreme Court decided that was a good idea. Chinese people are ineligible to testify too. The result, murder, robbery, land taking could all be done with impunity. By 1867, politicians promised white voters that they would fight against any law that would make Black, indigenous, or Chinese people equal to whites. By the 1920s, California became known as a strong Klan state, with sizable population, Klan chapters in Oakland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Anaheim, Fresno, Sacramento.
There you go.
And so it's in that time that a lot of Asian Americans arrived, turn of the century beginning, and that was the toxic milieu that they landed into. And so when my parents, were, along with 8,000 Bay Area Japanese Americans, ordered out of their homes at gunpoint and put in temporary holding pens. In the Bay Area, it was Tanforan racetrack surrounded by barbed wire and machine gun towers. my parents didn't miss the irony that the drinking fountains and the toilets were marked by signs reading white and colored. And here they were now living in a horse stall, having been forced out of their homes. And the indicators of Jim Crow thoroughly infected California were right before them. And so the canon simply shifted a little bit, and another disfavored population ended up in the crosshairs. And so this kind of truth-telling, I think, is important, that this doesn't just involve Black Americans. This is everybody's fight, and it really goes to the heart of who we think we are as Americans. And as long as we don't reckon with this racial pathology that began in 1619, it's going to just continue to churn and recycle. And we know this is true. You know, when Asian Americans were blamed for the Chinese virus, Mexicans were labeled as drug dealers and rapists, Muslims were called terrorists. Jews and immigrants were claimed to be poised to be ready to replace good white Americans. And so this is a pathology that America has never reckoned with. And it results in all of the issues that you all are dealing with on a daily basis as a matter of policy. And so, yeah, solidarity is going to be key in this fight.
Thank you, Don. Take us home. Assemblymember Bryant, the pathway forward for all of us.
I think the pathway forward is all of these things working in concert with one another and in collaboration and talking to each other. Philanthropy has to be aligning itself with community-based policy decisions that are built in solidarity with other communities. Black folks didn't do this to ourselves, and we're certainly not going to undo the generations of that harm by ourselves. I'll tell you a little secret about Black legislators. None of us represent a majority Black district. They don't exist in California. If you have a district that is more than 25% Black, that is very Black in California, and a population that is 6% Black. So solidarity and coalition building, we are the coalition legislators. Every Black elected official in the state legislature has to be able to build coalitions, or we wouldn't be in office. That being said, there are twice as many recommendations in the recommendations task force as there have been Black legislators in California's entire history. So when I say we can't do this by ourselves, I mean that as a call to action in all seriousness for all of you who are in this room and who know other people who care about doing what's right, who care about justice, who care about restoration and reparations. Because if we lift Black folks, if we repair the harms to Black folks, we are on a pathway to repairing harm and lifting up all folks in California.
That's right.
Right. It is an important and solemn conversation. This room was hushed a bit listening to these extraordinary leaders. It's an important conversation for this state moving forward. So let's end with some gratitude, though. This particular panel, this set of extraordinary leaders, let's go ahead and give them a rousing round of support for all they do for us. There you go. Yes, please.
Thank you all.
Thank you. And I want to thank all of you for being on this journey with us to the pathway to reparation.